our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to UnSpun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's Unspun. It was a rally in Ohio, and the crowd was packed in tight. American flags were waving, and they were holding their signs up high. And then the speaker said this.
I'm back in the center of the American heartland, far away from the Washington swamp, to spend time with thousands of true American patriots.
That moment right there. It's a perfect example of what we're diving into today, the seductive and dangerous logical fallacy known as the appeal to purity. What if I told you that the words true patriots are actually a linguistic trap? It's a rhetorical sleight of hand designed to make you stop thinking and start feeling. And today we're going to unpack how this works, why it works, and most importantly, how you can defend yourself against it. Sound good? Let's get unspun. All right, first, let's break down what we mean by the appeal to purity. It's basically a trick where someone tries to draw a circle around a group and say only the people inside this circle are real or legitimate or worthy. You can think of it like choosing sides in a game when someone suddenly decides who gets to play. Oh, you're not a real soccer player because you don't have cleats, or you're not a true fan of our team because you didn't paint your face. The key is creating some super high standard that conveniently excludes anyone who disagrees. In politics, it might sound like real Americans believe X, or true progressives would never support Y. The trick is that these statements aren't actually arguments, but instead they're emotional barriers that are designed to shut down conversation. So why does this work? Well, it's because humans are tribal. We want to belong. When someone tells us we can be part of a group we admire, whether that's patriots or true believers or real whatever it is, that feels good and it's flattering. And seeking that flattery kind of short circuits our critical thinking. So an appeal to purity relies on three key moves. You create an idealized group identity, and then you set impossible membership requirements, and then you exclude anyone who doesn't match those requirements. And it's kind of disturbing, but Americans think of these kinds of purity tests in different ways depending on what they already believe politically. In an editorial, Jack Bernard, writing for Gwinnett newspapers, talked about cancel culture. And so what does that mean anyway? Bernard writes, quote, Pew Research did a poll asking Americans about cancel culture, and its findings were interesting. Nearly half of Americans had heard of the phrase, with 64% of those under 30 familiar with it. Liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans were the most familiar with the term, but they defined it differently. The majority of Democrats tended to see it as meaning actions taken to hold others accountable, whereas only 36% of Republican conservatives believed that was accurate. And more than a quarter of the GOP respondents saw it negatively as censorship of speech or history. And a relatively large percentage of Republicans also believed it meant canceling anyone they disagreed with, mean-spirited actions meant to cause others harm, and an attack on traditional American society. Here's the dangerous part. These arguments aren't just annoying. Historically, they've been used to justify some of our worst moments. We're talking about a dangerous idea that's repeatedly reshaped societies, sometimes with really devastating consequences. So, for example, you can take the Jim Crow South. After the Civil War, as Black Americans sought to exercise their newly won rights, white politicians didn't just argue against integration. They constructed an entire mythology of who was a, quote, real American. In Louisiana's 1898 Constitutional Convention, delegates openly discussed how to, quote, purify the electorate. They didn't just want to prevent Black voting. They wanted to define citizenship in such a way that it explicitly excluded Black Americans. When it came to voting, one way of doing this was the grandfather clause. So voting rights were only given to men whose grandfathers had been eligible to vote. Now, enslaved people couldn't vote before the Civil War, so this instantly disenfranchised most Black voters. And it wasn't just discrimination. It was discrimination, but it was also a systematic attempt to define true citizenship through bloodline and through history. Japanese internment during World War II is another good example. After Pearl Harbor, politicians and military leaders didn't just have wartime suspicion, they constructed an entire narrative about racial purity and national loyalty. General John DeWitt, who oversaw the internment, repeatedly claimed that Japanese Americans, even those born in the United States, could not be trusted because of their racial background. Listen to this. In 1942, DeWitt testified to Congress, quote, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he's an American citizen or not." This is the appeal to purity weaponized into national policy. And about 120,000 people, 2/3 of them American citizens, were actually forced from their homes, and they lost their businesses and property and years of their lives just based on this logic of impurity. Religious conflicts offer another profound example. So during the European wars of religion in the 16th and 17th centuries, both Catholics and Protestants used purity arguments to justify some pretty horrific violence. For example, in France, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of 1572 saw thousands of Protestants killed by Catholics who argued that the only legitimate Christians were true Catholics. So, this is not just an abstract debate. These are arguments that got people killed or stripped of their rights and fundamentally just dehumanized. But the pattern's always the same. Define a narrow definition of belonging, declare most people outside that definition, and then use that to justify exclusion or oppression or violence. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's history, and we've moved beyond that. But the appeal to purity is alive and well in our current political landscape, too. Have a listen.
Hillary Clinton has called herself a progressive with a plan. Do you think Hillary Clinton is a progressive?
Some days, yes. Except when she announces that she is a proud moderate. And then I guess she is not a progressive. I think, frankly, it is very hard to be a real progressive and to take on the establishment in a way that I think has to be taken when you become as dependent as she has through her super PAC and in other ways on Wall Street or drug company money.
That's Bernie Sanders talking about whether Hillary Clinton could be a real progressive because she gets funding from Wall Street into her super PAC. And these kind of phrases aren't accidents. They're calculated strategies that are designed to do something specific, right? They're trying to draw lines or create divisions and make people feel like they have to choose sides. We could take the 2020 and 2024 election cycles, and we saw repeated rhetoric about real Americans. And so that's usually code for voters in specific demographic groups, particularly white Christian voters. The candidate just doesn't say, "I disagree with my opponent." Instead, they suggest that voting for the other side means somehow you're less American. Listen to this segment from Hulk Hogan's speech at this year's Republican convention.
But what I found out was I was in a room full of real Americans, brother. And at the end of the day, with our leader up there, my hero, that gladiator, we're gonna bring America back together. One real American at a time, brother. You know something? I've seen some great tag teams in my time. Hulk Hogan and, ooh yeah, the Macho Man Randy Savage. But you know something? I see the greatest tag team of my life standing upon us, getting ready to straighten this country out for all the real Americans. Even though you guys are real Americans, you better get ready. Because when Donald J. Trump becomes the President of the United States, all the real Americans are going to be nicknamed Trumpites. Because all the Trumpites are going to be running wild for 4 years.
This trick is subtle. How many times does Hogan say real Americans in that little over a minute? So, what are people who don't support Trump or don't want to run wild for 4 years? What are they? Well, according to this logic, they're not real Americans. And political strategists know something powerful. Humans have this deep psychological need to belong. So when someone tells you that you can prove that you're worthy by supporting a particular candidate or ideology, it kind of triggers something primal in you because it's not about the argument, it's about your own identity. And that's why the appeal to purity is so dangerous. It transforms political disagreement into an existential threat to someone's sense of self. So how do we defend ourselves against this kind of trap? Let's build a toolkit for intellectual self-defense. And, of course, first we need to do recognition. So when you hear phrases like true patriots or real Americans, stop, giant red stop sign. These are red flags because they're not describing something, they're trying to manipulate you. Here are 3 key strategies to fight back. First of all, ask for specifics. When someone claims only true members of a group believe something, ask, what exactly do you mean by true? Who decides? And by forcing them to define their terms, you expose the emptiness of the argument. For example, if someone says real progressives would never support this policy, respond with, what specifically makes someone a real progressive? Can you define that? Now, second, challenge the hidden assumptions because every appeal to purity relies on an unspoken claim that there's only one legitimate way to be part of a group. But groups are more complex than that. So a response might sound like, well, I'm an American and I see this differently. And my perspective is a part of our national conversation. It's not outside of it. Or, as some people have said, dissent is patriotic. And third, depersonalize the argument. These tactics work by making you feel personally attacked. So reframe the conversation back to ideas, not identity. Instead of getting defensive, say something like, let's discuss the actual policy, not who's a real anything. The goal isn't to win an argument. It's to create space for actual thinking. Let me give you a concrete example of how these strategies work in real time. Let's imagine that you're at a family dinner, and someone says, real Christians would never support immigration reform. Instead of getting defensive, you might respond, what specifically makes someone a real Christian? You could ask questions like, is compassion not a Christian value? Can you explain how excluding people aligns with religious teachings? So notice what just happened. You didn't attack, you asked for clarification, and you shifted from emotion to analysis. Because the most powerful weapon against the appeal to purity is simple. It's curiosity. It's not anger. It's not defensiveness. It's just genuine questioning. You can think of it like being a detective. These arguments are like magic tricks. They rely on misdirection, and your job is to look behind the curtain. So the moment someone tries to define you out of existence, you have the power to say, no, I'm part of this conversation. My perspective matters. Because these aren't just debate techniques, they're tools of democratic discourse, and they're how we refuse to let ourselves be divided. So today we've gone from historical backgrounds to political rallies, and here's what we've learned. The appeal to purity is never really about who belongs. It's about control. So whether it's blocking voting rights or justifying internment camps or turning political disagreements into tribal wars, this rhetorical trick always does the same thing. It tries to make you smaller, to make your experience less valid, to push you out. But here's the truth. No one gets to define the reality of your patriotism or your identity or your faith except you. And so when someone tries to draw a circle and tell you that you're outside of it, you have a choice. You can let that definition confuse you, or you can just recognize it for what it is. It's a cheap trick designed to divide us. Because real belonging isn't about passing a test. It's about engaging, listening, and understanding, even when it's hard. Have a great week. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception, Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.